Chapter 3. Colonel Lloyd kept a large, fine garden, which kept 4 men and the chief gardener almost constantly busy. The garden was probably the greatest attraction of the place. In the summer, people came from as far away as Baltimore and Annapolis to see it. It contained fruits of almost every kind, from the hardy apple of the north to the delicate orange of the south. The garden was a source of great trouble on the plantation. Its excellent fruit was quite a temptation to the hungry swarms of boys, as well as the older slaves. Hardly a day passed during the summer, but that some slave was whipped for stealing fruit. The colonel tried all kinds of tricks to keep his slaves out of the garden. The last and most successful one was to spread tar all over the fence that surrounded it. After that, if a slave was caught with any tar on himself, it was considered proof that he had tried to enter the garden, and he was severely whipped by the chief gardener. This plan worked well, as the slaves became as fearful of tar as of the whip. The colonel also kept a splendid collection of horses and carriages. The horses were of the finest form and noblest blood. His carriage house contained 3 splendid large coaches, 3 or 4 small 2-wheeled carriages, plus several other vehicles of the latest fashion. The carriage house was cared for by 2 slaves, a father and son, old Barney and young Barney. This was their only work, but their job was not easy, for Colonel Lloyd was extremely particular about his horses. The slightest neglect of them was unpardonable, and the colonel constantly suspected such neglect. This, of course, made old and young Barney's jobs very difficult. They never knew when they were safe from punishment. They were frequently whipped when they didn't deserve it, and escaped whipping when they did. Everything depended on the looks of the horses and the state of Colonel Lloyd's mind when the horses were brought to him. If a horse did not move fast enough or hold its head high enough, it was the keeper's fault. It was painful to stand near the stable door and hear his complaints against the keepers. This horse has not had proper attention. He has not been rubbed or combed enough, or he has not been properly fed. His food is too wet or too dry. He was fed too early or too late. He is too hot or too cold. He has had too much hay and not enough grain. He has had too much grain and not enough hay. Instead of old Barney caring for the horse, he very improperly left it to young Barney. To all these complaints, no matter how unfair, the slave must never answer a word. Colonel Lloyd could not bear any contradiction from a slave. When he spoke, a slave must stand, listen, and tremble. I have seen Colonel Lloyd make old Barney, a man between 50 and 60 years of age, uncover his bald head, kneel down upon the cold, damp ground, and receive upon his work-worn shoulders more than 30 lashes of the whip. Colonel Lloyd had 3 sons and 3 sons-in-law. All 6 lived at the great house farm, and were allowed to whip the servants when they pleased, from old Barney down to the coach driver. It would be almost impossible to describe the riches of Colonel Lloyd. He kept from 10 to 15 house servants, and he was said to own 1,000 slaves. Colonel Lloyd owned so many that he did not know them when he saw them, nor did all the slaves living on the outlying farms know him. People say that while riding along the road one day, the colonel met a colored man. He spoke to him the way white men usually did in the South. "Well, boy, whom do you belong to?" "To Colonel Lloyd," replied the slave. "And does the colonel treat you well?" he asked. "No, sir," was the reply. "Does he work you too hard?" asked the colonel. "Yes, sir." "Well, don't he give you enough to eat?" "Yes, sir, he gives me enough, such as it is," the slave answered. The colonel rode on, and the man also went on about his business, not dreaming that he had been talking with his master. He heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks afterward. The poor man was then told by his overseer that, as punishment for criticizing his master, he was being sold to a Georgia traveslater. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and without a moment's warning, snatched away from his family and friends. This is the penalty of telling the truth to a series of plain questions. As a result of such incidents, when slaves are asked about their condition and the character of their master, they almost always say that they are contented and that their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send spies in among their slaves to ask such questions. When I was a slave, I was frequently asked if I had a kind master. I always said yes. Furthermore, I did not think I was absolutely lying, for I judged my master against the slaveholders around us. Slaves are like other people, and they have their own prejudices. They like to believe that their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, even when the very reverse is true. Slaves will even quarrel among themselves, each arguing that his master is better than that of the other man's. It was so on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would claim that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves would say that he was the smartest and more of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast of his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson, Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast of his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight, and the slaves that won were supposed to have proved their point. They seemed to think that the greatest of their master was somehow transferred to themselves. It was considered bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was a disgrace indeed.